A civilization that vanished before history began. 12,000 years ago, before Egypt, before Sumer, before anything we call civilization, something existed. Something organized. Something sophisticated. Something that built in stone, read the stars, and then disappeared. Not slowly. Not gradually. Gone. And the most disturbing part? The evidence has been there the entire time. We buried it. Dismissed it. Filed it under myth. This is the investigation that changes that. Southeastern Turkey. The Sanayurfa province. 11 kilometers north of a city that has existed, in some form, for 10,000 years. The hills here look like any other hills. Until you look closer. These pillars were not found by accident. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at a site that local farmers had been quietly avoiding for generations. The ground here had a reputation. Strange stones. Unusual formations. The Kurdish name for the hill, Göbekli Tepe, translates simply as Potbelly Hill. Unassuming. Deliberate, perhaps, in its lack of drama. Schmidt began to dig. What he found would, in his own words, require us to throw out our archaeology textbooks and start over. Göbekli Tepe is not one structure. It is a complex, a sprawling series of circular enclosures, each containing between 6 and 12 of these T-shaped pillars arranged in precise concentric rings. The two largest pillars in each enclosure stand at the center, facing each other like sentinels. Their carved surfaces are not decorative. Researchers increasingly believe they are communicative, that the animals, the symbols, the abstract marks are a language, encoding something we have not yet fully translated. The carbon dating came back. And it stopped everyone in the room. 9,600 years before the Common Era. 11,600 years ago. Let that land for a moment. Göbekli Tepe is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It is older than the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates the invention of writing. It predates the invention of pottery. It predates, and this is the detail that makes archaeologists go quiet, it predates organized agriculture. This is the model we were taught. Human beings were hunter-gatherers. Nomadic. Survival-focused. Then gradually they learned to farm. Farming created surplus. Surplus allowed settlement. Settlement allowed specialization. Specialization, over centuries, allowed the kind of complex social organization required to plan, coordinate, and execute large construction projects. Temples came last. Monuments came after cities. That is the model. Göbekli Tepe does not fit the model. Göbekli Tepe, built by people our textbooks classify as pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, is a monumental religious complex of breathtaking sophistication, requiring the coordinated labor of hundreds, possibly thousands of people, sustained over generations, in a period when those people were supposedly still focused entirely on finding their next meal. Klaus Schmidt spent the rest of his life at this site. He said, in interviews, that the scale of what lay beneath the surface exceeded what his team could excavate in his lifetime. He was right. As of today, less than 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been uncovered. The remainder of the complex, its full scope, its deeper levels, its oldest structures, remains underground. But it is not what Schmidt found that is most extraordinary. It is what he found had been done to it. Sometime around 8000 BCE, after the complex had been in use for 1600 years, Göbekli Tepe was buried. Not by time. Not by natural accumulation. Not by neglect. By intention. The people who built this place, or their descendants or whoever came after them, filled every enclosure deliberately with a mixture of flint tools, animal bones, and clean limestone rubble. They covered the pillars. They sealed the chambers. They returned the hill as closely as possible to the appearance of undisturbed earth. Then they left. And the site remained sealed, preserved perfectly beneath that intentional burial for 11,000 years, until Klaus Schmidt's team removed the first shovelful of fill in 1994. Why would you bury your most sacred site? This is not a rhetorical question. Archaeologists have debated it intensely. Some argue it was a ritual act, a ceremonial closure, a deliberate end to the site's sacred function. Others suggest the burial was protective, that whoever sealed it knew something was coming, and wanted to preserve what was inside. Others point to the timing. Göbekli Tepe is sealed at almost exactly the same moment that the first evidence of systematic agriculture appears in the same region. As if one era ended and another was deliberately initiated. As if someone drew a line. We will return to that question. We will return to it because the answer, when the evidence finally forces it, will tell us something about who built this place that is far more significant than the building itself. For now, understand this. Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly in the sense of being unique. It is an anomaly in the sense of being impossible. Impossible within the framework we have been using to understand human history. And impossible things in science do not mean the thing didn't happen. They mean the framework is wrong. Something built this. Something organized enough to quarry and transport 20-ton stones. Something sophisticated enough to carve them with precision tools. Something that operated, coordinated, and planned, 12,000 years ago, at a level of social complexity that our models say should not have existed for another 6,000 years. The question is not whether Göbekli Tepe exists. You can visit it. You can touch the stones. The question is what it implies. And what it implies is that we are not looking at the beginning of human civilization. We are looking at a remnant of something that came before it. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. When researchers began mapping sites of similar age, similar sophistication, and similar impossibility, a pattern emerged that no single archaeological framework has yet explained. That pattern is where we go next. When Klaus Schmidt's findings at Göbekli Tepe were published, the academic world responded in stages. First, skepticism. The dating must be wrong. The site must be misunderstood. Pre-agricultural people did not build monumental temple complexes. By definition, they did not. Then, reluctant confirmation. The dating was verified by multiple independent laboratories. The stratigraphy was unambiguous. The carved animal reliefs were not primitive. The site was real and it was old and it was sophisticated. Then, the question that nobody wanted to ask out loud. If this one is real, are there others? The answer, it turns out, is yes. Beginning in 2019, Turkish archaeologists launched what they called the Taz Tepeler project. Stone Hills, a systematic survey of the region surrounding Göbekli Tepe. What they found restructured the entire regional picture. Göbekli Tepe was not a solitary monument. It was one node in a network. Karahan Tepe, Tazpeler, Kurtapeler, Göktepe, Harbutsuvan Tepesi. At least 12 sites, so far, in the same geographic region, dating to the same era, sharing the same architectural vocabulary of T-shaped limestone pillars, circular enclosures and sophisticated animal carvings. Each site distinct. Each site unmistakably related. Not copies of each other, variations. Like dialects of the same architectural language. At Karahan Tepe, excavated from 2019 onward, archaeologists found something Göbekli Tepe did not contain: human representations. Life-size stone heads. Figures emerging from bedrock as if the stone itself were giving birth to them. At one structure, a carved phallus nearly 2 meters tall stands at the center of an enclosure whose walls are lined with carved serpents. Dozens of them coiling from floor level to eye level in a continuous frieze. This is not primitive art. This is a developed iconographic program. This is theology rendered in stone by people who had thought, at length, about what they were trying to express. But the regional network is only the first layer of the pattern. Because when researchers began looking beyond southeastern Turkey, looking at the same era, the same window of time between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, the picture expanded dramatically. And uncomfortably. The Gulf of Khumbat, Western India, 2001. An Indian oceanographic research vessel conducting routine sonar surveys of the ocean floor detects anomalous formations at a depth of approximately 40 meters. The formations are geometrically regular in ways that natural sedimentation does not produce. Structures that look like walls. What appears to be a grid. The team sends divers. They recover artifacts from the site, including a piece of wood that is subsequently carbon dated. The date, approximately 7,500 years before the Common Era. The Indian government funded a formal inquiry. The findings were announced at a press conference. The then Minister of Science and Technology described the discovery as the oldest known civilization on Earth, potentially rewriting the history of South Asian culture. The formal published report, the scientific paper that would have subjected the findings to peer review and established the discovery in the academic record, was never completed. The inquiry was quietly discontinued. The sonar images remain. The carbon date remains. The formal scientific verdict does not exist. We will return to the question of why, and whether this case is isolated, in Chapter 7. Nabta Playa. Southern Egypt. Deep in what is now the Western Desert, a region that receives less than 1 millimeter of rainfall per year, archaeologists have excavated a ceremonial complex unlike anything else in the region. A circle of standing stones, carefully positioned. A series of megalithic structures. An astronomical alignment that precisely tracks the summer solstice and the rising of specific stars. The date, approximately 7,000 to 6,500 years before the Common Era. This is a calendar built by people living in what was then, due to a different climatic cycle, a viable savanna environment. Built by people who, according to the standard model, were pastoralists, cattle herders, without the social complexity to construct astronomical observatories. The stones say otherwise. Here is what the distribution of these sites produces when you look at it as a single image. Not random emergence. Not isolated development. A pattern. A pattern distributed across the planet, clustered in the same narrow window of time, that period between 12,000 and 6,000 years before the present, that the standard model insists was the era of primitive pre-civilizational humanity. Now, here is the part that requires your full attention. These sites are geographically separated by thousands of miles. The cultures that produced them had, according to conventional archaeology, no meaningful contact with each other. There were no trade routes, no shared language, no mechanism of transmission. And yet, in 12 separate, unconnected cultural traditions distributed across every inhabited continent on Earth, there exists the same story. A great civilization. A catastrophic flood. A small group of survivors. A god or teacher who arrives from the sea to rebuild what was lost. 12 cultures. No contact. One story. When seismologists detect identical wave patterns on opposite sides of the planet at the same moment, they do not file it under coincidence. They look for the shared source event, the single origin point that produced identical ripples at every point of measurement. What is the shared source event here? Whatever it was, it left its mark in stone, in story, and apparently in the ocean floor. And the ocean floor is where the most important evidence may be hiding. Because when we calculate what the coastlines of the world looked like 12,000 years ago, before the ice melted, before the seas rose, before everything changed, we encounter a discovery so fundamental that it demands the question be asked again, seriously and without dismissal. What was living there? This is Earth as it looked 20,000 years ago. The same planet. The same continents. But approximately 30% more habitable land than exists today, because the water that now fills the world's shallow coastal seas was locked, frozen, in ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were, at that time, approximately 120 to 130 meters lower than they are today. Everything you see above the current waterline was above water then. But so was everything up to 130 meters below the current waterline. And that is not empty ocean floor. That is continental shelf. Rich, flat, well-watered, climatically temperate land, located in almost every case at the coastlines and river mouths that humans have always preferentially settled. Between approximately 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, as the ice sheets of the last glacial maximum melted, that land disappeared. Not all at once. Not smoothly. The sea level rise was punctuated by events, periods of catastrophically rapid inundation caused by the sudden collapse of major ice sheets. The first great pulse, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred approximately 14,600 years ago. In a period of roughly 5 centuries, an eye blink in geological time, sea levels rose by an estimated 12 to 22 meters globally. In some coastal regions, the sea advanced miles inland within a single human lifetime. The second major pulse occurred approximately 11,600 years ago. That date will become significant. What these cores show us is that the end of the last glacial period was not a gentle transition. There were multiple episodes of rapid, dramatic change, temperature swings of 8 to 10 degrees Celsius within decades. Sea level pulses that reorganized coastlines within human memory. For any coastal population living through Meltwater Pulse 1A, the experience would have been, there's no other word for it, catastrophic. Let us be precise about what was lost. The Persian Gulf Basin, today an arm of the Indian Ocean, was until approximately 8,000 years ago, a dry river valley. The combined drainage of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun and Wadi Batin rivers flowed through this valley toward a coastline located near the modern Strait of Hormuz. This valley, well-watered, fertile, climatically favorable, would have been among the most desirable settlement locations in the ancient Middle East. When the Gulf flooded, it flooded rapidly. Estimates suggest the inundation of the Persian Gulf Basin may have occurred within a period of centuries, perhaps less. Any population living in that valley faced a choice: move or drown. The Arabian-Persian Gulf Basin hypothesis, developed by archaeologist Jeffrey Rose and others, proposes that this region was a refuge population center during the arid glacial maximum, a place where humans survived and developed cultural complexity while the surrounding regions were too dry for dense habitation. When the Gulf flooded, that population dispersed into the surrounding regions of what are now Iran, Iraq, the Arabian Peninsula, and South Asia. The timing of this dispersal aligns, with uncomfortable precision, with the sudden emergence of complex culture in the Fertile Crescent. Doggerland. The name sounds invented. It is not. Between Britain and the European mainland, the North Sea is shallow, rarely more than 50 meters deep. 20,000 years ago, that shallow basin was dry land, a vast fertile plain, crossed by the ancient course of the Thames and Rhine rivers as they flowed northward to the sea. Researchers estimate Doggerland was home to significant human populations, hunters, fishers, early settlers, throughout the late Paleolithic and early Mesolithic periods. By approximately 6,500 years before the Common Era, Doggerland was entirely submerged. Fishermen working the southern North Sea have been dredging up artifacts from Doggerland for generations, worked bone tools, animal remains, and at least one human bone from the ocean floor. The remains of an entire inhabited world, sitting on the seabed 50 meters below the waves. The Sunda Shelf. During the glacial maximum, the islands of Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and Bali were not islands. They were the southern coastal margins of a landmass, sometimes called Sundaland, roughly the size of the Indian subcontinent. This landmass, in the tropical zone, perpetually warm, fed by equatorial rainfall and major river systems, would have offered exceptional conditions for human habitation and cultural development. It is now beneath 50 to 100 meters of the South China Sea and the Java Sea. Genetic evidence suggests that Southeast Asia was a major population center in the Paleolithic, and that populations from this region dispersed outward in multiple migration waves. What culture those populations carried with them from what kind of homeland cannot currently be determined, because the homeland is underwater. Here is the core problem. The standard model of archaeological investigation relies on surface and near-surface excavation. We dig where we can reach. We find what has not been covered. And for the vast majority of human prehistory, the period when our species was developing its most fundamental cultural, technological, and social capacities, the primary inhabited zones were coastal and riverine environments. Those environments are now underwater. We are, in the most literal sense possible, looking for the origins of human civilization in the wrong places, because the right places require underwater archaeology at depths and scales that current research programs are not funded to pursue. And this brings us to the question that Chapter 3 must answer honestly. Is this absence of evidence actually evidence of absence? Or is it evidence of a methodological gap, a systematic blind spot built into archaeology by the simple fact that water covers the places we most need to look? The geological record says the sea rose. The habitable land disappeared. The populations who lived there moved. What we cannot yet say, what the evidence does not yet confirm, but what it increasingly refuses to rule out, is what level of cultural complexity those populations had achieved before the water came. But there is one line of evidence that may answer that question indirectly. Not from the ocean floor. From the sky. And from a layer of soil so thin, and so diagnostic, that it has changed the entire conversation. Ice cores are time machines. Each year of snowfall compresses into a distinct layer, trapping, within its crystalline structure, samples of the atmosphere that existed when that snow fell. Air bubbles containing the precise chemical composition of the air from that year. Dust particles blown from distant continents. Volcanic ash from eruptions thousands of miles away. Chemical markers from fires, from cosmic events, from everything that touched the atmosphere of that particular year. Glaciologists can read these layers the way historians read documents. And in the Greenland ice cores, in a layer corresponding to approximately 10,800 years before the Common Era, something unusual appears. A platinum anomaly. Elevated iridium. Microscopic spherules of melted material, tiny glass beads that form only under conditions of extreme heat, the kind of heat generated by a massive impact or atmospheric fireball. And nanodiamonds, carbon structures that require extraordinary pressure to form, pressure not generated by any known geological process at the Earth's surface, but readily produced by a large cosmic impact event. This layer is not found only in Greenland. The same chemical signature, the same platinum spike, the same nanodiamonds, the same impact spherules, has been identified at multiple sites across 4 continents, all within the same geological horizon. All dating to the same narrow window, approximately 10,800 years before the Common Era. This is the signature of the Younger Dryas boundary event. In 2007, a team of researchers led by physicist Richard Firestone published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences proposing that the Younger Dryas period, a sudden, severe return to glacial conditions that interrupted the warming at the end of the last ice age, was triggered by a cosmic impact or airburst event. The paper was met with intense skepticism. It has since been followed by dozens of additional peer-reviewed studies. The impact layer has been confirmed at more sites, across more continents by more independent research teams. The debate in the scientific literature is no longer about whether the impact markers exist. It is about what exactly the impacting object was, and precisely how it caused what followed. What followed was this. Global temperatures dropped by an estimated 8 to 10 degrees Celsius, not over centuries but within decades. The warming that had been underway since the glacial maximum reversed, sharply and catastrophically. Ice sheets that had been retreating began to re-advance. The monsoon systems of Asia and Africa weakened dramatically. The megafauna of North America, woolly mammoths, American horses, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, ground sloths, went extinct within this same window, along with an estimated 35 genera of large mammals across the northern hemisphere. The Clovis culture of North America, the earliest well-documented human presence on that continent, disappears from the archaeological record at exactly this horizon. Not a gradual decline. A disappearance. Abu Huraira, northern Syria. This site was excavated in the 1970s before it was flooded by the Assad Reservoir. The excavation documented one of the earliest known transitions from hunting and gathering to agriculture. A transition that appears at this site to have been forced by dramatic environmental collapse rather than gradual cultural development. But there is something else at Abu Huraira that the original excavation reports did not fully account for. At the Younger Dryas boundary layer, the same layer that contains the platinum anomaly across 4 continents, Abu Huraira contains evidence of extreme thermal events. Melted building materials. Burned bone. Silicate glass formed at temperatures exceeding 1700 degrees Celsius. Plant material carbonized in conditions that suggest something hotter than any domestic fire. The pattern of the burning is not consistent with a structure fire. It is consistent with an overhead thermal event, an airburst of the type produced by a large meteorite or cometary fragment disintegrating in the atmosphere above the site. The Tunguska event. Siberia, 1908. A cosmic object, estimated at 50 to 80 meters in diameter, detonated in the atmosphere above a remote forest. It leveled approximately 2,000 square kilometers of trees, released energy equivalent to approximately 1,000 Hiroshima bombs, and left no crater, because it never reached the surface. If an object of that scale had detonated over a populated area, the historical record might have attributed the destruction to divine judgment. The physical evidence, without a crater to point to, would have been ambiguous. The Younger Dryas impactor, or impactors, may have been significantly larger than Tunguska. And in 2018, a confirmation arrived from an unexpected direction. The Hiawatha Crater. Discovered beneath the Greenland ice sheet by a team led by Kurt Kjaer of the University of Copenhagen. 31 kilometers in diameter. Formed by an iron meteorite estimated to have been approximately 1 kilometer across. The crater's age, based on the overlying ice stratigraphy, is consistent with the Younger Dryas boundary, though pinning its precise date has proven technically difficult. Not all researchers are convinced it dates to exactly this event. But its existence, a crater of this scale in precisely the region where ice core records show the strongest impact signatures, is not nothing. What does this mean for the civilization we are investigating? It means that at the precise moment when Göbekli Tepe was at the height of its construction and use, the pre-pottery Neolithic period, the era when the pattern of globally distributed sophisticated sites was most active, something hit the Earth. Something large enough to drop global temperatures by 10 degrees in a matter of decades. Large enough to collapse the North American megafauna. Large enough to leave chemical signatures across 4 continents. Large enough to produce the abrupt, catastrophic disruption of every coastal, ice margin and river valley population on the planet. If a civilization of meaningful complexity existed in the coastal and shelf regions of the world in 10,800 BCE, and the evidence we have reviewed increasingly suggests something did, the Younger Dryas event is the mechanism that erased it. Not gradually. Not over centuries. In the span of a human lifetime. The survivors would have experienced something for which no modern framework of experience provides comparison. The sky on fire. The temperature collapsing. The seas, already rising from the earlier meltwater pulse, becoming unpredictable and violent. the animals they depended on dying around them. Everything they had built, every structure, every archive, every accumulated body of knowledge, vulnerable to the chaos of a world suddenly violently reorganized. What do survivors do in the aftermath of something like that? They remember. And sometimes, when the knowledge is important enough, when the survivors are organized enough, they do more than remember. They encode. For most of modern intellectual history, mythology has been understood as one of two things. Either it is theology, the sacred narrative of a culture's relationship with the divine, not intended as literal history and not to be read as such. Or it is psychology, the externalization of universal human experiences and fears into narrative form. Carl Jung's archetypes. Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Patterns that emerge independently from the deep structure of human cognition, not from shared historical experience. Both of these frameworks have produced genuine insight. Neither of them can explain what we are about to show you. The flood myth is the most widely distributed story in human cultural history. It exists, in some form, in the mythological traditions of virtually every culture on Earth. That fact alone is not remarkable. Floods happen everywhere. Communities experience floods. Communities make stories about floods. The universality of flood mythology has been used repeatedly to argue that these stories are parallel inventions, local responses to local flooding events, dressed in similar narrative clothing because floods, as human experiences, tend to produce similar emotional and narrative responses. This argument is reasonable. It is also insufficient, because the stories are not merely similar in structure. They are identical in detail, at a level of specificity that parallel invention cannot explain. When I map the shared elements across 12 flood traditions, Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Hindu, Greek, Mesoamerican, Chinese, Norse, Aboriginal Australian, Native American, West African, the overlap is not thematic. It's structural. You have a divine or cosmic warning to a specific individual, a vessel of preservation, a boat, an ark, the preservation of seeds, animals, or sacred knowledge, a global inundation destroying the previous civilization, a landing on a mountain after the waters recede, a bird sent to search for land, the founding of a new civilization by the survivors. This is not a genre. This is a specific story. It's the same specific story. The divergences are in the cultural details. The core narrative events are identical. Let us examine 3 cases in detail. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, Mesopotamia. The earliest written version dates to approximately 2100 BCE, but the narrative it encodes is almost certainly older. Utnapishtim, a man favored by the god Enki, is warned of the coming flood. He builds a vessel. He loads it with his family, craftsmen, animals, and crucially, the seed of all living things. The flood destroys all human civilization. Utnapishtim's vessel comes to rest on a mountain. He releases a dove, a swallow, and a raven to test whether land has appeared. When the raven does not return, he knows the waters have receded. This story predates the book of Genesis by over 1,000 years. The parallel is not coincidental. Biblical scholars widely acknowledge the literary relationship between the two texts. But that relationship simply pushes the question back further. Where did the Mesopotamian tradition get this story? The Matsya Purana. Hindu tradition. The sage Manu is washing his hands in a river when a small fish speaks to him, warning him of the coming deluge. He is instructed to build a ship and to load it with seeds of every plant, along with the 7 great sages. The fish, an avatar of Vishnu, grows to immense size and guides the ship through the flood to a northern mountain. After the waters recede, Manu becomes the progenitor of the new human race. Divine warning. Vessel. Seeds. Survivors. Mountain. New civilization. The Sanskrit tradition has no textual relationship with the Mesopotamian tradition. The stories share no linguistic ancestor. They are products of entirely separate cultural and literary histories. And they are the same story. In 2016, researchers Patrick Nunn and Nick Reed published a paper in the journal Australian Geographer examining Aboriginal Australian oral traditions that describe specific coastal flooding events. Stories of coastlines submerging, islands forming where there had been land, bays appearing where their ancestors had walked. These are not vague metaphors. They are geographic descriptions, specific enough that Nunn and Reed were able to correlate them with known geological records of sea level rise in those exact locations. And some of these stories describe events that occurred between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. They are among the oldest verified historical records in human existence, preserved not in writing which hadn't been invented, but an oral tradition, maintained with sufficient fidelity over hundreds of generations to accurately describe the physical geography of coastlines that have been underwater since before agriculture existed. This is the moment that changes the documentary. If Aboriginal Australian oral tradition can accurately preserve specific geographic information about flooding events 10,000 years old, then the question about the global flood myth tradition shifts entirely. It is no longer, could oral tradition preserve memory of the Younger Dryas catastrophe? We now know it could. We have documented proof that it did in at least one tradition. The question becomes, did it? And here, in a text written by a Greek philosopher in 360 BCE, we encounter something that has never been satisfactorily explained. In the Timaeus, Plato describes a conversation between the Athenian statesman Solon and an Egyptian priest at the temple of Sais. The priest tells Solon something that stops the Athenian in his tracks. He says, and the translation is Jowitz, close to the original, "You Greeks are all children. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science that is hoary with age. You have no knowledge of antiquity. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes." The priest then describes a civilization destroyed by flood, a civilization that was powerful, sophisticated, and now forgotten by the Greeks, who have lost the old knowledge in their own cultural catastrophes. The question I keep coming back to is, why would you invent that? What is the narrative purpose of having an Egyptian priest tell a Greek that the Greeks have forgotten their own ancient history? It doesn't serve Plato's philosophical agenda. It doesn't support any known political or religious agenda of his time. It's presented as received tradition, something the priest knows because Egypt maintained records that Greece did not. As a literary invention, it's strangely purposeless. As a preserved memory, it makes complete sense. And here is where you must make a decision. The evidence before you is real. The flood myths are real. The geological record of catastrophic flooding is real. The Australian oral tradition's verified accuracy is real. The Plato passage is real. The question of interpretation is yours. Are these mythologies spiritual archetypes, parallel inventions emerging from the universal human experience of natural disaster, wearing similar costumes because the human mind processes catastrophe in similar ways? Or are they something else? Are they the fragmented, distorted, partially preserved memories of a real event, transmitted across 12,000 years by the only medium powerful enough to survive? Story? The documentary will not answer this for you. What the documentary will do, in the chapters that follow, is show you what the evidence looks like if the second answer is true. Because if the flood myths are memory, then someone survived. And survivors, when they are organized, do not only remember, they plan. In the aftermath of the Younger Dryas event, in the long, difficult recovery period between approximately 10,000 and 6,000 years before the Common Era, something remarkable happens across the ancient world. Settled agriculture begins. Urban planning emerges. Writing systems develop. Astronomical observation becomes systematic. Legal codes appear. Mathematical knowledge is encoded and transmitted. In the Standard Model, these developments emerge gradually and independently across multiple regions, driven by local ecological conditions and the accumulated pressure of population growth. But the Standard Model has a problem. These developments do not emerge gradually. In region after region across the ancient world, the transition from pre-agricultural social organization to complex settled civilization appears not as a slow gradient but as a sudden step, a discontinuity in the archaeological record that looks less like gradual invention and more like the arrival of something already developed. And in each of those regions, the cultural tradition preserves a specific explanation for that discontinuity. A teacher arrived. From the sea. Whence? The Babylonian historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE but drawing on much older Mesopotamian traditions, describes a being who appeared from the sea in the earliest period of Babylonian history. This being, part man, part fish, spent the days among human beings teaching them. He gave them, in Berossus's words, insight into letters and sciences and every kind of art. He taught them how to construct cities, how to found temples, how to compile laws, how to practice geometry. At night Oannes returned to the sea. Berossus says explicitly that after Oannes, no further instruction was required, that everything necessary for civilized life had been given. The Egyptian god of writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and the measurement of time. Described, in the earliest Egyptian texts, not as a god who was created alongside the other gods of the Egyptian pantheon, but as one who existed before them, who was present at a time prior to the current order of divine things. the keeper of sacred records, the preserver of knowledge through cosmic catastrophe. In some traditions, Thoth is described as the author of the 42 sacred texts called the Books of Thoth, a body of knowledge said to encompass all the wisdom of the world. The Hermetic tradition of late antiquity, which claimed descent from Egyptian priestly knowledge, associated Thoth Hermes with the preservation of universal knowledge through a great flood, which the tradition called the universal deluge. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, present in the Aztec, Toltec, and Maya traditions. A culture hero who arrived, consistently described as having arrived by sea from the east, and taught the people agriculture, calendar calculation, mathematics, and the arts of civilization. Physically described in multiple traditions as bearded and light-skinned, attributes anomalous in Mesoamerican iconography, suggesting a memory of someone who looked different from the indigenous population. Quetzalcoatl in the Aztec tradition promises to return. Viracocha, the Andean creator deity whose tradition describes him as appearing after a great flood, building Tiwanaku, teaching law and agriculture to the survivors, and then departing across the Pacific Ocean, walking on the surface of the water, the tradition says, promising to return. The Viracocha tradition explicitly describes the civilization he encountered as a second attempt at humanity, the first having been destroyed. And here, at the intersection of archaeology and mythology, the open loop from Chapter 1 closes. Why was Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried? The burial occurs at approximately the same time that the Neolithic Revolution, the sudden, rapid adoption of agriculture, spreads outward from the Fertile Crescent across Europe and Asia. The timing is not coincidental. Something changed. Something was completed or concluded at Göbekli Tepe, and what replaced it was the organized agricultural community, the settlement, the granary, the early city. Schmidt himself proposed that Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement but a gathering place, a pilgrimage site where dispersed populations came together for ritual, for teaching, for the transmission of knowledge. When that function was no longer required, when the knowledge had been successfully transmitted, when the new agricultural communities had been established and organized, the site was sealed. Not destroyed. Preserved. Filed away. A record, deliberately hidden, of what had been known and what had been done. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge embedded in these civilizer traditions is not incidental. It is central. Oannes teaches geometry. Thoth is the god of mathematics and astronomical measurement. The Maya tradition, whose calendar system encodes the precession of the equinoxes with a precision requiring centuries of systematic observation, attributes its mathematical knowledge to divine teaching. The precession of the equinoxes is a 25,920-year cycle produced by a slow wobble in Earth's rotational axis. To calculate it accurately requires continuous sky observation over many generations, at minimum several centuries of systematic record-keeping. Yet it is accurately encoded in the mythological and architectural traditions of ancient Egypt, Babylon, India, and Mesoamerica, all of which are recovering post-Younger Dryas civilizations. Where did this knowledge come from? The most parsimonious explanation available, not the only explanation but the most parsimonious, is that it was transmitted. That someone who possessed this knowledge survived the Younger Dryas event, and deliberately passed it on. The civilizer figures come from the sea. They arrive after floods. They teach the knowledge of a lost world. They do not stay. If this tradition is memory rather than invention, and the parallel mythological structure across isolated cultures increasingly demands we consider that possibility, then what it describes is a coordinated transmission event. A group of survivors from a more sophisticated pre-Younger Dryas culture, organized and deliberate enough to disperse across the post-catastrophe world and seed the recovery of civilization at multiple points simultaneously. The evidence for their existence is indirect. It lives in story, in monument, in encoded astronomical knowledge, and in the deliberate preservation of a temple complex beneath a hillside in southern Turkey. But the evidence for institutional resistance to this conclusion, resistance organized, systematic, and persistent, is considerably more direct. Science is not a collection of facts. It is a process, a methodology for evaluating evidence, testing hypotheses, and revising understanding in response to new information. That is the ideal. The reality of science, practiced by human beings within institutions that have hierarchies, funding dependencies, publication pressures, and professional reputations at stake, is sometimes something different. This chapter is about the gap between those two things. Robert Schoch is a geologist with a PhD from Yale, a faculty position at Boston University, and a research specialty in stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and what they indicate about the conditions in which they formed. He is brought to Egypt by a researcher named John Anthony West, who has proposed that the erosion patterns on the body of the Great Sphinx of Giza suggest a date of construction far earlier than the Egyptological consensus of approximately 2500 BCE. Schoch examines the Sphinx enclosure, the trench surrounding the body of the monument, and sees something immediately recognizable to him as a geologist. The erosion pattern on the limestone walls of the enclosure is vertical, deep channels running from top to bottom, consistent with prolonged rainfall erosion. The kind of rainfall Egypt last received in significant quantities at approximately 700 to 1500 BCE. If the Sphinx enclosure shows rainfall erosion, the enclosure was carved during a period of significant rainfall, which means the Sphinx, or at minimum its enclosure, predates the conventional date by several thousand years. Schoch presents this finding at a geological conference. His geological colleagues find the argument credible. The weathering patterns are real. The stratigraphy is real. The argument is sound within the discipline of geology. The Egyptological establishment responds not with counter-evidence but with counter-assertion. The Sphinx was built by Khafre. The ancient Egyptians documented their own history. The geological reading must be wrong because the archaeological reading is established. Egyptologist Mark Lehner says the monument cannot be older than the Pharaonic period because there is no evidence of the civilization that would have had to build it. Schoch points out that this is circular reasoning. The absence of evidence for an earlier civilization is being used to disprove evidence that an earlier civilization existed. No geological rebuttal of Schoch's weathering analysis is ever published in a peer-reviewed journal. The professional opposition is persistent, sustained, and entirely conducted without engaging the geological argument on its own terms. This pattern has a precedent. J. Harlan Bretz was a geologist who, in the 1920s, proposed that the channeled scablands of Washington state, a landscape of bizarre, gigantic geological features unlike anything produced by normal erosion, were created by a catastrophic flood of unimaginable scale. A single event. A wall of water miles high, released by the sudden collapse of an ice dam holding back a glacial lake the size of Lake Ontario. The geological establishment of the time rejected this hypothesis with intensity bordering on hostility. Catastrophism, the idea that geological features could be produced by sudden, dramatic events rather than gradual processes, was ideologically suspect, too close to biblical flood narratives to be scientifically respectable. Bretz was right. The Missoula floods are now geological consensus, confirmed by decades of subsequent research. Bretz received the Penrose Medal, the highest honor of the Geological Society of America, at the age of 96. The scientists who opposed him spent their careers in the wrong. The Gulf of Khumbat discovery, announced with considerable fanfare by the Indian government in 2001, should have generated a major international research initiative. The sonar images were ambiguous but substantial. The carbon dating of recovered organic material was verifiable. The geographic logic, a submerged river valley that would have been above water until approximately 6,000 years ago, was sound. Instead, silence. The formal scientific paper that would have submitted the findings to peer review was never completed. The Indian government's research program was discontinued without published findings. Requests from international researchers for access to the raw sonar data have been met with institutional friction. The problem isn't that institutions are conspiring to hide evidence. It's much more mundane than that and in some ways more intractable. If the Khumbat discovery is real, if there is a complex urban settlement beneath the Gulf dating to 8,000 years ago, then the history of South Asian civilization needs to be entirely rewritten. Multiple careers, multiple textbooks, multiple institutional frameworks become incorrect. The professional cost of accepting that evidence, within existing academic structures, is enormous. It's much easier professionally to let the question quietly disappear. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of how institutions function under pressure, a dynamic that sociologists of science have documented extensively across multiple fields and multiple centuries. Thomas Kuhn called it paradigm defense, the tendency of established scientific frameworks to resist contradictory evidence not through formal rebuttal but through institutional marginalization of the researchers who produce it. The researchers who work on prehistorical civilizations are not, as a class, credulous or methodologically weak. Several hold doctorates from elite institutions. Several have published in peer-reviewed journals in their primary disciplines. Robert Schoch's geological credentials are not in question. The Indian oceanographers who surveyed the Gulf of Khumbat are not amateurs. What distinguishes them from their mainstream colleagues is not the quality of their methodology. It is the nature of their conclusions. Here is the irony that the history of science keeps producing generation after generation. The institutions designed to evaluate evidence and revise understanding are staffed by human beings whose professional identities are built on existing understanding. The more fundamental the revision required, the stronger the institutional resistance, not because the evidence is examined and found wanting, but because the evidence, if accepted, would be professionally catastrophic. Brett's waited decades for vindication. The Missoula floods are now in every geology textbook. The question about Göbekli Tepe, about the Younger Dryas boundary, about the submerged continental shelves, is whether we are waiting for the same delayed recognition. But the ground does not wait for institutions. And in the monuments that have survived, the ones above water, the ones we can measure and map and calculate, the ground has already given us something that should not be explainable. I want to be clear about what I'm doing here. I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm not a mystic. I'm a mathematician. And what I am showing you are the results of applying standard mathematical analysis to the verified physical dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The numbers that come out of that analysis are, there's no better word, anomalous. They require explanation. The Great Pyramid of Giza. Built, according to conventional Egyptology, during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, approximately 2560 BCE. The largest of the three major pyramids on the Giza Plateau. Height, approximately 146.5 meters at original completion. Base perimeter, approximately 921 meters. The precision of its construction, the tolerance of its angles, the alignment of its faces to cardinal north, is extraordinary by any standard, ancient or modern. But the precision of its geometry is something else. The perimeter of the Great Pyramid's base, divided by twice its height, yields a value of approximately 3.14159. But, accurate to 4 decimal places. The ratio of its height to half its base, the slope angle of its faces, yields a value of approximately 1.618. The golden ratio. The mathematical proportion found throughout natural growth systems, from nautilus shells to the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower. These are not contested numbers. They emerge from the verified physical dimensions of the monument. The debate is not about whether they are there. The debate is about whether they were intentional. The argument against intentionality is that the builders might have arrived at these ratios through practical construction methods, using a wheel of specific circumference to measure, for example, without consciously encoding mathematical constants. That's a legitimate argument. But then you have to account for the geographic constant as well. The pyramid's geographic coordinates, its position on Earth's surface, encode the ratio of Earth's land mass to its water surface, accurate to 3 decimal places, at a time when no culture on Earth had the cartographic knowledge to measure that ratio. That one is harder to explain through practical construction methods. The Great Pyramid's mathematical anomalies are the best known. They are not the only example. Angkor Wat, Cambodia. Constructed in the early 12th century CE as a Hindu temple complex dedicated to Vishnu, the largest religious monument in the world. And according to a detailed analysis conducted by researcher Graham Hancock and architect John Grigsby in the 1990s, an architectural encoding of the Hindu precessional cycle. The precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year cycle of Earth's rotational wobble, is encoded in the distances, proportions and astronomical alignments of Angkor Wat's architecture with a precision that the temple's architects acknowledged by using a number system based on units of the precessional cycle in their planning geometry. The Cambodian architects of the 12th century were drawing on Hindu mathematical traditions that they attributed to divine origin, traditions they had inherited, they believed, from teachers far older than themselves. The Antikythera mechanism. Recovered in 1901 from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, dated to approximately 100 BCE. A device constructed of interlocking bronze gears, 82 fragments survive, whose function was not understood for over a century. When fully reconstructed using modern X-ray imaging and computational modeling, its function was revealed. It is an analog astronomical calculator. It predicts solar and lunar eclipses. It calculates the positions of the 5 planets known to ancient astronomy. It models the irregular speed of the moon's orbit, a second-order calculation requiring knowledge of advanced mathematics. It incorporates a Fourier dial tracking the Greek Olympiad cycle. Nothing comparable in mechanical sophistication appears in the historical record for over 1,000 years. The Antikythera mechanism was not an incremental development. It was a device from a tradition that has no documented antecedent, a tradition that, apparently, did not survive. What the Antikythera mechanism tells you is that there was a level of mathematical and mechanical sophistication in the ancient Mediterranean world that we have no trace of in the preceding centuries. No prototypes. No simpler predecessors. It appears fully formed in the archaeological record and then disappears. That's not how technology normally develops. That's what transmission looks like, the arrival of something already complete from somewhere else. The precession of the equinoxes. This cycle, 25,920 years for the Earth's axis to complete one full wobble, is encoded in the mythology and monumental architecture of ancient Egypt, Babylon, India, and Mesoamerica. Each culture calculates it slightly differently, using slightly different astronomical methods. But each arrives at the same cycle with the same precision. To calculate precession requires sustained, systematic sky observation across multiple generations. Ancient cultures that began from zero, from first principles with no inherited astronomical tradition, would require centuries of dedicated observation merely to identify the cycle, let alone calculate it precisely. All four of the above traditions attribute their astronomical knowledge not to human discovery but to divine teaching, to a teacher who arrived after a great disruption and provided the knowledge as a gift from an earlier age. Here is what these monuments collectively imply. A level of mathematical, astronomical, and architectural knowledge was present in the ancient world, encoded in physical structures that have survived, that is not explicable by the gradual, independent development of the cultures that built those structures. The knowledge was sophisticated before the cultures were sophisticated. It arrived as if fully formed at the founding moments of these civilizations. And it was attributed, consistently and explicitly, to teachers from an earlier age who carried knowledge from a world that no longer existed. This is either the most coherent pattern of organized cultural transmission in human history, or it is a coincidence so vast, so precisely articulated in stone and mathematics, that it requires the suspension of every probability standard we normally apply to historical evidence. I teach my students to follow the mathematics. The mathematics in this case goes somewhere that most people aren't prepared to go. But that's not a reason not to follow it. The evidence has now accumulated across 8 chapters. The physical anomaly at Göbekli Tepe and its network of sister sites. The geological record of catastrophic sea level rise. The Younger Dryas impact event and its 4-continent chemical signature. The global flood myth traditions and their verified historical accuracy in at least one case. The civilizer figures and their consistent arrival from sea narrative. The institutional resistance to evidence that challenges the established timeline. The mathematical encoding in monuments that should not contain it. The question is no longer, is there evidence of something? The question is, what was it? And that question, honestly confronted, produces not one answer but 3. We have reached the point in the investigation where the honest answer is, we do not know. The evidence is real. Its interpretation is not settled. And the 3 frameworks through which researchers approach this evidence are not merely different conclusions, they are different ways of understanding what history is, how it works, and what human beings are capable of. Each framework has genuine explanatory power. Each framework has genuine weaknesses. None of them is complete. This chapter will present all 3 without editorializing. What you do with them is your decision. A sophisticated culture, organized, astronomical, architecturally capable, existed during the period before the Younger Dryas event, in the now submerged coastal and shelf regions of the ancient world. The most frequently proposed locations are the Persian Gulf Basin, the Sundaland Shelf of Southeast Asia, or the coastal periphery of what is now the Indian Ocean Basin. This civilization was destroyed or severely disrupted by the Younger Dryas event and its associated sea level rise. Its survivors dispersed globally, some organized and purposeful, carrying preserved knowledge into the post-catastrophe world. Others simply fleeing, carrying cultural memories that degraded over generations into myth. The civilizer figures of world mythology are memories of these survivors, the organized knowledge-bearers who arrived in post-catastrophe cultures and catalyzed the recovery of civilization. Göbekli Tepe and its network are either products of this civilization, built before the Younger Dryas event and surviving due to their inland location, or are products of the immediate post-catastrophe period, built by survivors as pilgrimage and teaching centers for the transmission of preserved knowledge. The mathematical encoding in later monuments, Egypt, Angkor Wat, Mesoamerica, represents the transmitted remnants of a sophisticated pre-catastrophe mathematical tradition, passed on through priestly lineages and eventually embedded in permanent stone. Strength. This framework explains the simultaneous emergence of complex culture across disconnected regions, the civilizer figure traditions, the mathematical encoding, and the Göbekli Tepe timeline anomaly. Weakness: the source civilization has not been physically located. The submerged shelf regions have not been adequately surveyed. Without a confirmed site, the framework remains hypothetical, compelling, coherent, but not yet confirmed. Human beings share a cognitive architecture, a brain shaped by a common evolutionary history. When faced with similar environmental conditions and similar cognitive challenges, human minds produce similar solutions. The parallels in world mythology reflect the universality of human psychological experience, not shared historical memory. The parallels in mathematical and astronomical knowledge reflect the universality of the physical world. The same sky, the same geometry, producing the same observations in any culture that looks carefully enough. Göbekli Tepe is not a remnant of a lost civilization. It is evidence that the standard civilizational timeline is simply wrong, that pre-agricultural societies were more cognitively and socially complex than the model assumed, and that the transition to agriculture was triggered by environmental pressure rather than intellectual development. The Younger Dryas event may have been precisely that environmental pressure, disrupting foraging economies and forcing the adoption of agriculture as a survival strategy. The mathematical encoding in ancient monuments is real but overinterpreted. Precision construction methods naturally produce mathematical ratios. The astronomical knowledge in ancient traditions reflects centuries of careful observation by intelligent people, not transmission from a lost source. Strength: this framework requires no unconfirmed entities. It explains Göbekli Tepe without positing a lost civilization. It is consistent with the general principle of explanatory parsimony. Weakness: it struggles to account for the specific structural identity of flood myths across 12 unconnected cultures, not merely similar themes but identical narrative events in identical sequence. It does not fully explain the Antikythera mechanism's lack of documented precursors. And it does not explain why the mathematical precision of ancient monuments exceeds what their builders' documented knowledge base should have produced. The Younger Dryas event was not unique. The geological record of the past 2 million years, the Quaternary period, shows repeated glacial cycles, each accompanied by the environmental disruptions capable of disrupting or destroying advanced cultures. Human cognitive capacity has been essentially modern for at least 200,000 years. In that time, multiple cycles of cultural development and catastrophic collapse may have occurred, each resetting the archaeological record and beginning again. What we call the beginning of civilization is not the beginning. It is the most recent recovery, the post-Younger Dryas rebuilding of a human cultural capacity that may have reached comparable levels multiple times in the deep past. The evidence for earlier cycles is almost entirely destroyed, by glacial advance, by sea level change, by the simple fragility of pre-literate cultures over geological timescales. What survives are the anomalies. Sites like Göbekli Tepe that predate the recovery, monuments encoding knowledge that shouldn't exist yet, myths describing worlds that were destroyed before the current world began. Strength: consistent with the full geological record. Explains the mythological traditions that describe multiple prior civilizations. The Mayan description of the current age as the fourth or fifth attempt at humanity, the Hindu yugas, the Greek tradition of successive golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages. Weakness: makes a prediction that physical evidence of earlier cycles should exist, that current technology and methodology cannot yet confirm or deny. The hypothesis is coherent but currently unfalsifiable. 3 frameworks, each explaining something the others cannot, each failing where the others are strongest. This is not a failure of the investigation. This is what real scientific uncertainty looks like. The productive uncertainty that drives further research, further excavation, further inquiry. The question is not which framework is comfortable. The question is which framework the evidence, as it continues to accumulate, as the underwater surveys eventually happen, as the remaining 95% of Göbekli Tepe is eventually excavated, will confirm. That answer does not yet exist. But the question, the serious, evidence-based, rigorously framed question, now exists in a way it did not before this investigation began. And one question above all remains. We started here. 11,600 years ago in these hills, something was built. Something was used. Something was sealed, deliberately, carefully, and left for the future to find. We found it in 1994. We have spent the 30 years since then arguing about what it means. The argument is not resolved. But it has changed. It has changed in the most important way that an argument can change. It has become serious. Here is what this investigation has established with confidence. The standard timeline of human civilization, which places its meaningful beginning at approximately 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, is wrong. It was always wrong. It was a function of where we were looking, not of when civilization began. Göbekli Tepe alone establishes this. It is not speculation. It is carbon-dated stone. The world's continental shelves, the primary zones of human coastal habitation for most of our species' history, are submerged under 100 to 130 meters of water. They have not been systematically archaeologically surveyed. The assumption that nothing significant existed there is not a finding. It is an absence of inquiry, dressed as a conclusion. The Younger Dryas boundary event, whatever its precise mechanism, produced a documented, chemically verified four-continent signature of catastrophic disruption at precisely the moment in time when the evidence for prehistorical cultural complexity is highest. The correlation is real. The global flood myth tradition, in at least the Aboriginal Australian case, has been verified as accurate historical memory of real geological events. The structural identity of flood narratives across 12 unconnected cultures demands explanation that parallel invention does not adequately provide. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient monuments predates, in multiple cases, the documented development of the cultures that built those monuments. The Antikythera mechanism has no precursors. Precessional knowledge in four independent traditions has no independent origin point that we have been able to locate. Here is what this investigation has not established. The identity of the prehistorical civilization, if it was a single civilization, remains unknown. Its location, its name, its internal organization, its full technological capacity, unknown. Whether the civilizer figures of world mythology represent organized survivors of this culture or are purely mythological constructs, unresolved. Whether the mathematical encoding in ancient monuments represents transmission from a lost tradition or independent development through methods we have not identified, contested. Whether there are physical remains of this civilization on the submerged continental shelves, awaiting discovery, unknown because we have not adequately looked. The diffusionist says, look under the water. The evidence is there. We simply haven't found it yet. The convergentist says, the anomalies are real but they do not require a lost civilization. They require a more sophisticated model of what prehistorical humans were capable of. The catastrophist says, we may be asking the question too narrowly. The Younger Dryas was not the first reset. Human history may be longer and more tragic than we have imagined. All three may be partially correct. None of them is certainly complete. Here is the question that cannot be answered. If a civilization as sophisticated as ours, with our cities, our libraries, our digital archives, our accumulated science, were destroyed by an event of Younger Dryas scale, a cosmic impact, a catastrophic sea level rise, a decade of winter, how much of it would survive? Our coastal cities would be submerged. Our digital infrastructure would fail. Our books would rot. Our satellites would fall. The survivors, if there were survivors, would be isolated, traumatized, reduced to the basics of physical survival. In 12,000 years, what would remain? Perhaps some anomalous structures, too massive to be destroyed, in inland locations chosen for their defensibility against rising water. Perhaps mathematical constants encoded in those structures, too abstract to be burned, too precise to be accidental. Perhaps stories, told by grandmothers to children, generation after generation, distorting with each retelling, preserving the emotional truth of what happened while the factual details blur into myth. Perhaps in a library somewhere that survived, sealed, preserved, buried, a record, waiting. This is what Göbekli Tepe is. Whatever it means, whatever civilization built it, whatever knowledge it encoded, whatever catastrophe its builders anticipated when they sealed it, it is a message. From someone who understood that knowledge is fragile, and that the future would need to find what the past had learned. They buried it carefully. They preserved it completely. And they left it in the one medium that resists time better than any archive, any library, any digital system ever built. Stone. Final visual. The aerial shot pulling away from Göbekli Tepe. The hill receding. The plateau expanding. The landscape becoming larger and more ancient. Until the camera is high enough that the hill is just a point in an enormous, silent landscape. A civilization vanished before history began. We do not know its name. We do not know its full extent. We do not know exactly what it built or everything it knew, or how fully it understood what was coming. What we know is this. It left us something. and we are only now learning to read it. In the comments below, I want to know which framework you believe the evidence supports most strongly, diffusionist, convergentist, or catastrophist. And tell me, which single piece of evidence in this investigation most changed the way you think about human history? I read every comment. This conversation, unlike the civilization we've been investigating, is not over.